Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is the definitive, if I do say so myself, guide to the frequency of heavy training. Now, this is going to include your heavy singles, your heavy rep work with 80%, so on and so forth. We're going to talk everything from different programming implications in terms of your range of motion, the frequency that you can train heavy, and then ways to troubleshoot your range of motion to be able to use higher frequency of heavy lifting. This is mostly for guys that have a longer range of motion on their lifts just naturally. Getting right into it, though, we're going to go over to the table of contents and then briefly talk about each of the action pieces that we're going to talk about today. Starting with, of course, the benefits of heavy singles. You got to know why you're doing it. Likewise, you also have to know the limitations of what you're trying to do. One thing that I'll say preeminently that we'll talk about more when we speak more specifically about limitations is that there are limitations, quote unquote, that aren't intrinsic to heavy singles themselves and are more intrinsic to human error and ego, so on and so forth. There aren't very many limitations to training heavy. Pretty much you do it if you want to be strong, and if you don't do it, well, you don't care about being strong, which isn't a negative. If you care about lifting the heaviest weight possible, you're going to do some sort of 80% or higher rep work or singles. After we talk limitations and kind of offer some disillusioned viewpoints on kind of nocebos with heavy singles and heavy rep work, we're going to go through a self-assessment together. You're going to use this self-assessment to assess your objective range of motion on squat, bench, and deadlift, respectively. We're going to go through certain things that you're going to look at when you record yourself lifting, that if you fall into this area, you have a long range of motion relative to your height. Now, you can be a tall guy and have a short range of motion relative to your height, because it all has to do with limb lengths and individual proportions. We're going to talk a little bit about potential fatigue that you'll find depending upon your range of motion. And then that will then further depend upon your natural durability and just the strength of your muscles and your tendons and ligaments in general. But it's going to give you a broad scope of what to expect and how to train around fatigue that's going to be generated with heavy work. Moving from there, we're going to use that self-assessment to then key in on bench frequency specific to you. So you're going to take that self-assessment test with me, and I'm going to talk about each range of motion, but you're going to use that particular range of motion that you found and key in on what I'm specifically speaking to. We'll also talk exercise selection and or exercise rotation. Now, that can either be a rotation of exercises themselves or a variation of intensities, or both, depending upon the movement, depending upon the range of motion. We're going to do that for bench, squat, and deadlift respectively. Let me know in the comments down below now. Comment down below if you want me to do a video for overhead press and weighted pull-ups, since those are typically lifts that individuals will max out on. So pause, comment down below right now if you want to see that. And if enough people say that, I'll make a video for those lifts as well. From there, though, after we talk about the frequency that you're going to use on those particular lifts for your heavy work, we're going to talk about for individuals that typically always say that, oh, my range of motion is long, I have terrible genetics, I'm never going to be strong. I have a section specifically for you guys. So if you're a long range of motion lifter, comment down below. You know, team monkey arms, whatever the case may be. And then I'll have a section for you guys as well. So for example, it's going to talk about how to use floor press to make your money run longer, so to speak. Likewise for deadlift, squat. Starting with the benefits, because you got to understand why you're doing something. Like I said, heavy singles are defined by a single, so you do one rep with between 87 and 95% of your one rep max. Now, the reason why I don't go from 87 to 100% is because a 100% to failure single it's disproportionately fatiguing to even a 95% single. Because on a 100% single, you're getting absolutely everything you have. That fatigue isn't going to carry over to your rep work that you're going to hopefully do afterwards if you have any idea how to train. You don't just do heavy singles and leave. You do your rep work afterwards. And it's not something that you can condition yourself to, like regularly doing singles in that rep range. You can regularly hit 90, 95, 87% singles and it not affect your rep work after as you become accustomed to it. But when you do those singles, one of the benefits specifically, just with that tangent aside, is it gives skill practice with heavy lifting. You've heard everybody say it. Louis Simmons, there's lots of people on YouTube that train with conjugate style programs that say you have to train heavy because training heavy is a skill. Now, what they mean by that is that when you train with an objectively heavy load, you're going to have some muscles that are stronger than others. And that's going to expose itself when you do a heavy lift. You're going to use what's called a compensatory strategy. A compensatory strategy is you adjusting your body, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, in a way that allows you to lift the most weight possible. A lot of the times you only do that when you're approaching failure on rep work with lighter percentages, or when you're doing a heavy percentage for a single, in this case between 87 and 95%. You can only train for that instance where you have to use a compensatory strategy if you're training within a capacity that forces you to do that. Singles are an easier and more predictable and honestly safer way for you to do it than with rep work. Form degradation is intrinsic with rep work. Your form's going to be a lot crisper on a single as you approach that relative failure. So it's just then by extension going to be safer. Another thing that heavy singles do though is that they allow you to accurately assess your strength or perform a strength audit, so to speak, in the sense of how well your training program is going. So for example, if at the beginning of your training programming, your current training max on squat is 465 pounds. Pretty good. That's a pretty good squat. But it's like really hard. It's like 97%, and it's not something that you can do on any given day. Throughout the course of your training programming, your intro blocks, 9, 12 weeks in, there's days where you can hit 460. There's days where you can only hit 450. But as time goes on, you're now hitting at least 465 consistently, and it's easier than at the beginning of your training block. You can use that as a metric to tell you that, hey, what I'm doing is working. Likewise, if you're average, you're going to have your good days and your bad days. But if on average, your training maxes are going down, you're getting weaker. That doesn't mean, I'm weaker today, so I have to change everything around. No, you're looking at a broad spectrum of your training. So over the course of months, if you're consistently hitting heavier and heavier weights, on an average basis, you're getting stronger. Likewise, if you're consistently, as in more than one session, several sessions in a row, or several throughout your training program, hitting sub-maximal loads, like below your established training max to start off with, you're getting weaker. It's a strength audit. Just let you know where you're at. One really cool thing that it also does is that it gives you a really easy auto-regulation tool. And what does auto-regulation means? When you regulate something, you're basically dictating how it'll go. You auto-regulating it is essentially saying that based on your training max strength today, you're going to use that to calculate percentage backdowns. Or if you want to use RPE, you could use percentages and then like an RPE cap. For example, we'll use examples for both. Let's just say today that you hit 525 pounds on your conventional deadlift single and that you want to do back downs at 70%. That's kind of what the training program laid out for you. So let's just say, for example, it said work up to a training max and then do a 70% back down. Your training based upon that prescription at 70%, your back down work is going to be with 370 pounds, rounding up to the nearest 5. Now they want you to leave 2 reps in reserve with that, or that in RPE terms, that is an RPE 8. So you would do reps with 370 pounds, however many that is, until you're 2 reps away from failure, and then you're doing 3 sets. That's kind of the percentage plus RPE auto-regulated back down. Now, if you just wanted to do pure percentage back downs, you would just simply say, all right, you're going to do 70% of your top set for sets of 12. Now, your first set's going to be easier than your last set, but you're going to do straight sets of 12 across. Whereas with your RPE and percentage-based back down, you may do 12, and then just to keep within that 2 reps in reserve, you may do 10, and then 8, or however it breaks down. You're just staying within 2 reps from failure, no matter what that may be. So if you do less, doesn't matter as long as you're 2 reps away from failure. You're getting the desired and prescribed training effect. So those are all the benefits. There are a lot of programming applications that I can talk about in a separate video. Let me know if you want to see that in another lecture in the comments below. We're going to move on to the benefits of heavy rep work. So those were heavy singles. This is heavy rep work. It's kind of similar in the way that like squares and rectangles are similar, but they're distinct. Heavy rep work is distinct from heavy singles, obviously, because you're repeating this percentage for more than 1 rep. A lot of the benefits of heavy rep work are really only exclusively available to highly advantaged lifters. So by that I mean people who have short ranges of motion on their bench press, or short ranges of motion on their deadlift, or they can squat with a really upright back angle. Individuals like that typically are going to be able to do more reps with 80% plus of their 1 rep max. What does that mean? You're getting more specific, heavy volume that is going to carry over more closely to your 1 rep max than, say, doing the same number of reps with 70%. So for me, my percentages on bench are pretty much the vanilla percentages. So 70% is a 10 rep max, 80% is like a 7 rep max, 90% is like a 3 to 4 rep max. Someone who is very advantaged on bench press or like deadlift or squat is very commonly going to be able to do at least 9 reps with 80%. And I have seen very commonly as well that they can do 12 reps with 87%. So let's just say that they do a 3x10 with 80% at an 80% intensity versus me, I do a 3x10 at 70% intensity. They're a whole 10% closer to 100% than I am. So their strength, that is more strength specific, just objectively going by numbers. That is going to make you a heck of a lot bigger. It's going to make you a heck of a lot stronger and more efficient at that particular movement at a faster rate than I will ever be able to, or anyone that has more range of motion will ever be able to. You're probably wondering if you can benefit from that. We'll talk about that after we talk about the limitations of heavy training. And then we'll use that self-assessment to then talk about your frequency and how you would program it. Limitations, there's not many of them. In fact, there's one that's just intrinsic to heavy singles in general. And that's just pretty much depending upon your natural range of motion with that particular lift. You can't perform it as frequently as with individuals that just have lower objective natural ranges of motion. That's the only limitation. It's a limitation and not necessarily a negative. It's more of like a rule, so to speak. And that's the only limitation intrinsic to heavy rep work. It's not more dangerous than rep work with a lighter percentage, because more often than not, if you acquire an injury during training, you're doing it on a lift that is very submaximal. In rare cases, it may happen on a lift that is super maximal, meaning that like it's more than what you can lift. But that's not as common as someone just trampoline bench pressing with 60% for a bunch of reps, or just stopping short of their chest for a bunch of reps and then they tear a pec. Or people who tear their biceps with lighter weight, or people who tear their biceps on deadlift with lighter weight. It's not typical that you get injured lifting something heavy once. A lot of the perceived limitations, just in terms of like coaching someone, have to do more with either your ability to coach that individual or just human error on behalf of the individual themselves. So by that I mean, if you're not doing your due diligence with giving your trainee a set prescription that tells them kind of exertion levels to look out for or objective load. So if you're not consulting load with your client, they're pretty much just going to look at it. So if you say work up to a heavy single, they're going to damn near max out, especially if they're a male, because males' egos are more attached to their training numbers in comparison to women. And that's not a broad generalization, but it's what you'll find when you train people. Those two things, though, are not, they're not intrinsic to heavy singles themselves. They're just a misapplication of heavy singles. So that's a lack of coaching. So in terms of just human error on behalf of the trainee, if you prescribe them, hey, do 90%, and it's auto-calculated, so 90% of their 1 rep max deadlift is like 480 pounds, and they are to do that and then do their back down work based on that. And they choose to do 95% or 100% or go for a PR, so like 103%. That's the fatigue that comes from that, or potential injuries from going through a super maximal load. That's on them. It's not on the weight. Heavy singles didn't do that to them. They did it to themselves. I just want to make that distinction. That's not a limitation of heavy singles, because you can misapply anything that you do in training. It's just about effectively guiding people. And, sometimes people just honestly, they have to learn the hard way. Like, they have to see sometimes that if they overshoot, it's going to have a detriment on the rest of their training, probably for that session, going also into their next session as well. So we're going to go into the self-assessment of range of motion in a second. One thing that I just quickly wanted to touch on was post-activation potentiation. It's basically like a big brain, galaxy brain term that says when you lift something heavy, anything that you lift that's lighter than that is going to feel proportionately lighter. It's almost like caveman logic. It's so stupid a caveman could come up with it, but it does have merit, but it also has limitation depending on the lift. So for bench press, for example, typically, even if you have a longer range of motion, like I have a longer range of motion on bench press than most people, it's still with such a light load compared to what I can lift with my legs and through a shorter range of motion than my lower body lifts as well, that it's just not fatiguing on my body compared to a lower body lift. Because of that, I can benefit from post-activation potentiation on that. So a set of 10 with 70% of my 1 rep max after doing a single with 87 or more is going to feel lighter and just smoother and easier. But with lower body lifts, depending upon your range of motion, if you have a long range of motion on a heavy lower body lift, the fatigue that lift generates within the context of that exercise is going to nullify whatever post-activation potentiation you get. So it's like taking 2 steps forward to take 3 steps back, as opposed to taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So it's just something that you have to keep in mind. If you want to benefit from post-activation potentiation with your lower body, and this will be a timestamp, so you can skip right to the self-assessment test. one way you can use post-activation potentiation for your lower body is to do an explosive lower body movement. So that'll be something like a kettlebell swing for deadlift, an explosive hip hinge, and then box jumps for squats. Those will give you really good post-activation potentiation. So then when you go into your working sets or your warm-ups for your heavy singles, those will feel a lot better. But either way, you're going to have to deal with the fatigue that's generated from those heavy lower body singles, irrespective of if you use that post-activation potentiation strategy. But that aside, self-assessment of your range of motion. It's really simple. You record yourself from a side angle because you need to look at these things for your lower body lifts at least. For your bench, you're going to record so that if you're laying on the bench, the camera is facing, it's right in front of where your feet would be at. When you record yourself on bench, if your upper arm is parallel with the ground, you have a moderate range of motion. That's normal. However, if you have a below parallel arm angle, so your elbows point to the ground, that's a large range of motion. If your elbows point up or towards the wall more than, on a parallel bench, you're above parallel. You have short range of motion. Congratulations. You're going to be really good at bench press. With your squat, this is something that I don't think I've ever heard talked about specifically in terms of assessing your range of motion. But you're not necessarily looking at the range of motion of the squat itself, because typically if you're squatting for maximum strength, you're only squatting to where your thigh is parallel to the ground. So that's not what you want to look at. What you want to look at is your back angle. So if your lower back goes through a moderate amount of extension, you have what is so to speak a moderate range of motion on your squat. It's going to be less fatiguing. However, if you're squat morninging your squats, so if your squat looks like a good morning with a little bit of knee extension, that's going to be a lot more fatiguing than the former example. Likewise, the latter example, an Olympic style squat, in terms of your back angle being really erect and straight, that's going to be very low fatigue and very low range of motion on your lower back. Same kind of thing with the deadlifts. And this is more common sense. If your torso is parallel with the floor on your deadlifts, you're going to have a long range of motion. If you're more sloped, it's medium. And if you're really upright, it's low. So you're going to be really good at deadlifts. That being said, you guys went through the self-assessment test with me, hopefully. You've either looked at your training footage or you paused and made some. We're going to use that self-assessment test to kind of guide you guys through using heavy singles. So we're going to talk frequency first, and then we're going to talk variations, starting with bench press. So for you long range of motion guys like me, I perform a heavy single once every 7 days. That's just the best practice to make sure that your training isn't going to be unduly fatiguing and bleed into your rep work, because the rep work is ultimately what feeds your strength. Medium range of motion guys, so parallel range of motion benchers, typically are going to have less fatiguing max effort days, for lack of a better term, so that they can max out every 4 to 5 days. Short range of motion bench pressers can max out to a training max once every 2 or 3 days. So practically how this breaks down in a 7-day training split, I'm maxing out once a week. A medium range of motion bench presser is going to max out once a week, but it's going to be less fatiguing, and their training sessions are going to be more productive. And then the short range of motion bench pressers can and probably should max out more than once. Now, if you wanted to make your training split a training split that surpasses 7 days. So for example, just off the top of my head, a 7-day training split is something like a upper, lower, rest, upper, lower, rest, rest. That's a 7-day training split. However, if you wanted to have a 10-day training split, you do upper, lower, rest, upper, lower, rest, rest, upper, rest, upper, lower, rest, upper, lower, rest, rest. It's a 10-day training split. It makes sense. You're just elongating the amount of work that you're doing in your training week, so to speak, to 10 days so that you can fit more work in that specific time period. So for instances like that, your medium ROM guy, if they had a 10-day training split, they could max out twice before they go through that rotation of training days again, if that makes sense. That's something that medium range of motion bench press guy can really uniquely utilize versus just the long range of motion guy that's maxing out every training week, and that's intrinsic to regular training. And then the short range of motion guys are just maxing out all the time, so that's obviously going to fit into a 7-day training split. Now, order of variations, and this is going to start again with long range of motion bench pressers. You're going to start with a competition style, or just like your regular feet on the ground, 1 second pause bench press. You're going to start off your 3-week cycle, so to speak, with that. You're then going to go to a lower range of motion bench press. That's either going to be a floor press or a board press. Whatever you can do to reduce the range of motion, use that variation next. Then you're going to do a self-limiting version. For this, I use Larson press, but you can also do long pause bench. You can do feet up bench. Anything that is objectively harder than your competition style bench press that moves through a similar cadence on the concentric and eccentric. In other words, you wouldn't want to use a tempo bench. You wouldn't want to use, like I said, anything that slows down the tempo. So don't use a tempo bench there, because that's the wrong kind of self-limiting version. You want to keep things specific. So bar speed should be equal. Medium range of motion bench pressers are going to do something a little bit different. They can keep that regular powerlifting competition style bench press, but they're going to do it in undulating percentages and rep ranges. This one keeps the stimulus fresh, because you're going to go from doing 4s to 3s to 2s to 1s. You're going to do 4s at, say, 87%, 3s at 90%, 2s at 93%, and then 1s at maybe 95%. And then you'll cycle back, use a little bit more weight, or try to hit those same weights a little bit easier. And then that's how you would structure your bench frequency. The reason being why you can be more competition style specific is that your bench pressing at that percentage is just less fatiguing than someone with longer range of motion. So you don't have to have as much variation, because you're recovering more easily. Likewise, the short range of motion guy is going to keep everything super specific. They're going to use undulating percentages and rep ranges, or what they can also do as well is that they can just use a static load for their singles or doubles or whatever the case may be, and then just judge progression on how easy it is on a particular day. So they may bench 400 pounds one day, 400 pounds another day, but just one of those days it's easier. So moving on to the squat frequency and exercise selection. I'm getting ahead of myself. High low back range of motion, so meaning your good morning in your squat, once every 7 days. You don't need more than that, because not only is your back moving through a large range of motion, it's also very likely that if your back is going through that amount of extension, that you're using a pretty wide stance as well. So that's also greatly stressing your adductors. Your adductor can tear, your hamstring can tear. It's just not something that you want to push very hard if you're if you squat like an old school starting strength power lifter. You just don't want to do that. Everything breaks down just like the bench, though, pretty much. So the less range of motion that you have, the more often that you can perform singles. So for your medium range of motion guys, you're still maxing out once a week. But if you wanted to then do a 10-day training split, like a 10-day training rotation, you could max out more than once in that rotation. Variations, though. So for the good morning squat guys, being that your squat has a larger amount of back extension, it's more similar to a hip hinge. So you're recruiting more posterior chain, and it's more similar to a deadlift. So what you're going to do, just for best practice and to keep the stimulus fresh, you're going to do your squat, then you're going to deadlift. Then you're going to do a pause squat, then you're going to do a pause deadlift, and then that's your rotation, and you're going to do that weekly. Medium low back range of motion, so like a more normal, like everyday gym bro squat. Like you have a little bit of back extension, you're not quite upright, but you're not bent all the way over like some people are. You're going to do a squat, you're going to do a tempo squat to enforce that form that you have, and then you're going to rinse and repeat. You can throw in a pause squat there, you can slow down the tempo and then track it that way. It's not a lot that you have to do. You don't have to vary things like with the high low back range of motion guy, which isn't bad, by the way. High low back range of motion on squat means that your squat volume is going to feed your deadlift, so you don't have to do as much deadlift volume in your training. So none of these things are just weaknesses. What do I say all the time, guys? You may have subscribed to me from seeing me comment on someone's wall where someone is complaining about their range of motion, their leverages, whatever the case may be. They say, "Oh, well, I have long arms and my range of motion on bench is twice yours. That's why I don't bench 3 plates." Blah blah blah. You all know I'm of the opinion that leverages and genetics mean absolutely nothing about how far you can individually progress. Your leverages and your genetics and your muscle building capability, it dictates the way that you have to train to progress. So just think of it this way. If you play a game on hard mode, it's not that you can't beat it. You just can't run into enemy mobs without blocking and using skill and using intelligent gameplay to beat the mob of enemies or to beat the boss. You have to use strategy. You have to be smart. That's your guy with a high range of motion and bad leverages. For you guys that have good leverages, yeah, you can just run into the fucking room and just press buttons, and you're gonna beat the game and get an S rank on the mission. It's just how it is. You're still completing the same game. That doesn't mean I can't get an S rank on my hard mode playthrough. It's just harder to do that. Like I have to do different things. And that's all it is, guys. Everything has benefits and limitations and areas of opportunity. Rant aside, time stamped is next is the low back range of motion. You know, the guys with like what's his name? Toshiki Yamamoto, Clarence Kennedy, guys like that have really just godlike squats where they can stay completely upright. All you have to do is squat. That's why Olympic weightlifters squat with the frequency that they do, because they can get away with it. Their lower back isn't getting destroyed. Finally, deadlift frequency. It's a little bit different, but it's along the same lines as the frequency of every other lift. Deadlifts in general are going to be your strongest lift more often than not by a large margin. A large margin. It's at least going to be by 50 or 100 pounds typically. If it's not, you have a lower back weakness that's muscular, and if you correct that, your deadlift will be dramatically higher than your squat. For high range of motion individuals, you're going to want to deadlift once per 7 to 9 days. That just depends upon just your overall durability. So that may mean that, you know, it's not that you're not recovered every 7 days, but you're not really fully recovered, and you can get away with deadlifting weekly, but there's a certain point where fatigue is going to creep up with you. So what you want to do is, and we'll talk about this in a second, is vary that. With medium ROM, one time per week, you're not going to have a problem maxing or you doing a training max weekly if you have like a moderate range of motion. It's a lot of weight. It's a decent amount of range of motion. But it's not like you have T-Rex arms and you're trying to deadlift every week. But for short range of motion guys, again, you benefit from the gift of frequency. So you can get stronger easier. Exercise selection for high range of motion, guys. You're going to do your regular main stance deadlift, so competition style. Then you're going to do a paused deadlift, so with less load. And then you're going to do a squat. You could even do main stance variation, squat, and then pause. It doesn't particularly matter. Depending upon you and your leverages, even with squat, you may want to put the squat before the pause deadlift or the pause deadlift and then the squat. Medium range of motion deadlifters, you can just competition deadlift pretty regularly. You may want to use undulating percentages and undulating rep ranges. So you, again, start with 4s, you end off with 1s. It's like a mini linear periodization kind of. Short range of motion, guys. There's something really magical about heavy rep work and guys with either really advantaged conventional or sumo deadlifts, especially sumo deadlifts, because at the point where you're a really advantaged sumo deadlifter, your sumo deadlifts are kind of going to be lightweight squat volume. By lightweight, I mean they're kind of akin to squat volume. It's a colloquial phrase. Like there's just something really magical about being able to do like an AMRAP set of 80% and do 12 reps and then just doing 10, 11 rep sets with that. Typically, really advantaged deadlifts benefit from that really good. You're going to do that and you're going to do your competition singles. You can undulate that or you can just do straight singles and just measure exertion. This is going to be the section for you guys that have naturally long ranges of motion or even medium ranges of motion and just guidance with how to pick these variations. The shorter range of motion variations in general, though, like I said, are going to have the greatest utility for you long-armed, long-legged, short T-Rex arm deadlifter guys. These shorter range of motion lifts are going to allow you to get in more effective volume at higher percentages. Now, here's how you want to pick these movements. You have to keep in mind joint angle specificity. It's a big galaxy brain term for if you move the bar 12 inches on your competition bench press, you're going to want to make sure you're at least moving the bar 9 inches on a shorter range of motion variation for it to have effective carryover. If you're moving at 6 inches or 4, or you're doing lockout work, it's not going to have any carryover at all. None of the time, 0%, bullshit, waste of time. So, it only means that you either go from high range of motion to medium or medium to short. You don't go from long to short. Medium guys can go either way and get carryover. That's kind of like the rock, paper, scissors of it. Another benefit of this shorter range of motion variation that you can pick is that you can use the lower percentages actually to reduce fatigue versus doing a higher range of motion variation. What do we know about shorter range of motion lifts? You can do more reps with any given percentage. It's just most beneficial for strength to use the higher percentage ones. But likewise, if you're benching 3 times per week and you have a day that you typically do sets of 8 with 72%, it's kind of beating the shit out of you. So you're going to replace that with a board press or floor press at the same percentage and the same rep prescription. You're gonna still get in the effective volume. It's just gonna be less fatiguing because there's less range of motion, objectively. Your pecs are getting stretched less. Your pec minors getting beat down less. You're having to go through less retraction, less protraction. It's just less fatiguing. Likewise, you can use block pulls. You can use high bar squats. Things like that. This variance of fatigue. So the fatigue trending downwards is even going to apply if the shorter range of motion that you're using is equal to or less than your regular lift in terms of performance. Meaning, for me, for example, my floor press is actually less than my regular bench press. It's not more just because it's less range of motion. You're removing the leg drive. It's just harder than my regular bench press. But that being said, I can still do more reps with the same weight than on regular bench press. So it's less fatiguing. It's less range of motion. Doesn't matter necessarily about performance as long as it's not more. So as long as you're not using really, really super maximal loads, like don't do 520-pound block pulls when you can only deadlift 495 and then say, well, I'm using a shorter range of motion variation. What do we say, guys? Don't take 2 steps forward and then take 3 steps back. If you have to take any steps back, make sure that you're at a +1 at the very least. You don't want to break even because what's the fucking point? Typical variations, though. Floor press, low block pulls, Platz squat, where you're really upright, high bar squat, rack pulls, sumo deadlifts. Even if you're not great at sumo deadlifts, you're going to have less range of motion on those than your conventional deadlift, no matter who you are. And that's it, guys. That is the end of the lecture. Like I said, go ahead and leave me any particular questions you have about any of these things in the comments down below. Gonna do my best to give you guys really detailed answers as usual. But that's it. That's the lecture, guys. I will see you in the next one. Peace.